The morning sun peeked over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold and orange. The air was crisp, carrying a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves of the trees lining the palace grounds. Tourists from all corners of the world had already gathered, eager to catch a glimpse of the historic landmark and its iconic guards. Among them was an elderly man named Harold Jenkins, who stood out not because of his appearance but because of the quiet strength he exuded. Harold moved slowly, leaning on a wooden cane polished smooth by years of use. His steps were deliberate, each one marked by a slight shuffle as if his legs carried not just his weight but also the weight of countless memories. Despite his frailty, there was something unmistakable about him, a sense of purpose in the way he held himself upright, shoulders squared despite the toll time had taken on his body. He wore a simple jacket, faded but clean, and a cap that shielded his eyes from the growing sunlight. Beneath it, his face bore the lines of a life well lived. Wrinkles framed his mouth and eyes, telling stories without words. Harold paused near the edge of the courtyard, taking in the scene before him. Children ran around laughing, couples posed for pictures, and groups of friends chatted excitedly. Yet amidst all this activity, one figure stood apart: Captain Arthur Langley, the royal guard stationed at the entrance. Arthur was the epitome of discipline. Clad in his ceremonial uniform, complete with polished boots and a gleaming helmet adorned with a plume, he stood perfectly still. His posture was impeccable, every inch of him radiating professionalism. Not a single muscle twitched, even his breathing seemed controlled, almost mechanical. To the tourists snapping photos and marveling at his stoic presence, he appeared more like a statue than a human being. But Harold saw something different. As Harold approached, he studied the young guard with keen eyes. There was familiarity in Arthur's stance, a rigidity born not out of arrogance but out of duty. It reminded Harold of his own days in the military, standing watch during long nights under starlit skies. He remembered the cold biting at his fingers, the ache in his legs after hours of immobility, and the pride that came with knowing he was protecting something greater than himself. For a moment, Harold felt transported back to those days, reliving the camaraderie and sacrifices shared with men who had become brothers. But this wasn't war. This was peace. And yet, Harold couldn't help but feel a connection to the young man standing before him. He stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly as if trying to decipher some hidden message behind Arthur's unwavering gaze. Memories flooded back. Memories of battles fought, lives lost, and moments of triumph overshadowed by loss. These thoughts weighed heavily on Harold's heart, but they also filled him with gratitude. Gratitude for the freedom he had helped secure, and for the younger generations who now lived in safety because of it. With a deep breath, Harold steadied himself. Ignoring the stiffness in his joints, he straightened his back and adjusted his grip on the cane. Then, with slow but precise movements, he raised his right hand to his forehead in a salute. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was sharp, practiced, and filled with meaning. Every movement spoke of respect, honor, and recognition. Harold's salute wasn't just for Arthur. It was for everyone who wore a uniform, past and present. The crowd around them continued chatting and moving about, oblivious to the significance of what was happening. But Harold didn't care about the attention. This moment wasn't for show. It was personal. As his hand hovered near his temple, he locked eyes with Arthur, searching for any sign of acknowledgement. Would the guard notice? Would he understand the weight of the gesture? For a brief second, Harold wondered if he'd misjudged the situation. Perhaps Arthur would remain motionless, adhering strictly to protocol. After all, royal guards were known for their unyielding commitment to tradition. But then, something remarkable happened. Arthur's eyes flickered ever so slightly, betraying a hint of emotion beneath the surface. His expression remained neutral, but there was no mistaking the subtle shift in his demeanor. Harold's salute hadn't gone unnoticed, though Arthur didn't move entirely. He couldn't abandon his post or break formation. He made a small adjustment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he brought his gloved hand up to meet Harold's salute. It wasn't a full salute, nor was it meant to be. Instead, it was a restrained, respectful nod to the veteran's gesture. The movement was minimal, but its impact was immense. Harold's lips curved into a faint smile, his eyes softening as tears threatened to form. In that fleeting exchange, two worlds collided, one rooted in the past, the other firmly planted in the present. Nearby, a family of four watched the interaction unfold. The father leaned down to whisper to his son, "See that? That's called respect." The boy nodded wide-eyed as his mother snapped a photo. Others began to take notice too. A young woman holding her baby's hand murmured, "Wow, look at that!" Her voice carried enough to draw the attention of those around her. Soon a small group had formed, silently observing the poignant moment between the elderly man and the guard. Harold lowered his hand slowly, his chest swelling with emotion. He hadn't expected such a response, but he was grateful for it. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the rustling leaves and distant chatter. Arthur gave the slightest nod in return, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as though battling his own emotions. Though no words were exchanged, the mutual understanding between them was palpable. As Harold stepped back, allowing the crowd to disperse, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just chance. It was a reminder of the bonds that transcended generations, ranks, and roles. Harold had come to the palace seeking nothing more than a peaceful stroll through history. What he found instead was a renewed sense of connection, to the past, to the present, and to the enduring spirit of service that united them all. As Harold Jenkins lowered his hand from the crisp salute, a hush seemed to fall over the space between him and Captain Arthur Langley. The morning breeze continued to play with the edges of Harold's jacket, but time itself felt suspended for a moment. Tourists nearby had begun to notice the unusual exchange, their whispers growing louder as they pointed toward the elderly man and the stoic guard. Yet, neither Harold nor Arthur seemed aware of the growing attention. Their focus was entirely on each other, for Captain Langley, standing motionless in his ceremonial uniform, had always been second nature. Years of training had drilled into him the importance of maintaining composure no matter what happened around him. But today, something inside him stirred. It wasn't just the fact that an older gentleman had saluted him. People occasionally did that out of respect. But there was something profoundly different about this gesture. Harold's salute hadn't been casual or perfunctory. It was deliberate, heartfelt, and steeped in meaning. Arthur could see it in the way Harold held himself, even through the obvious signs of age and weariness. His posture spoke volumes, straight-backed, despite the cane, eyes steady despite the years etched into them. Arthur recognized that stance. He'd seen it in photographs of soldiers from decades past, men who had fought wars far removed from the comforts of modern life. And now, here stood one such man, offering him a salute not as a superior officer but as a fellow servant of duty. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Arthur. On one hand, protocol dictated that he remain still, unresponsive to external stimuli. Guards were trained to ignore distractions, whether it was curious tourists attempting to make them laugh or sudden weather changes testing their endurance. Breaking rank even slightly went against everything he'd been taught. But on the other hand, how could he ignore this? This wasn't just another tourist trying to get a reaction. It was a veteran paying homage, bridging the gap between two eras separated by decades yet united by shared values. Arthur's mind raced as he wrestled with these thoughts. His body remained rigid, betraying none of the turmoil within. For a fleeting second, he considered doing nothing at all. After all, staying completely still would have been easier and safer. No one would fault him for adhering strictly to protocol. But then, almost instinctively, he realized that sometimes rules existed not to be followed blindly, but to guide decisions when compassion demanded flexibility. With painstaking care, Arthur adjusted his stance ever so slightly. Slowly, deliberately, he brought his gloved hand up, not fully, not breaking formation, but just enough to acknowledge Harold's gesture. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention. To Harold, however, It meant the world. Harold's eyes softened immediately upon seeing Arthur's response. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed quickly by gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured again, his voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the crowd. Arthur didn't reply verbally. His actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. Yet the slight nod of acknowledgement he gave carried immense weight. It was a silent promise, a recognition of the bond they shared as individuals who understood the cost of service. The tourists around them began to react, more visibly now. Some gasped softly while others clapped their hands together in quiet admiration. A young woman holding her toddler whispered, "Did you see that?" The guard saluted back. Her tone was filled with awe, as though she'd witnessed something magical. Nearby, a middle-aged man leaned closer to his wife, saying, "That's incredible. I've never seen anything like it." Even children, usually distracted by the novelty of the palace grounds, paused to watch the unfolding scene. One teenage boy raised his phone to capture the moment, zooming in on Arthur and Harold. "Dad, why is everyone so emotional?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. His father smiled wistfully before replying, "Because sometimes, small gestures can mean the most. That guard just showed respect to someone who deserves it." Indeed, the ripple effect of Arthur's restrained salute spread rapidly throughout the courtyard. People who had been casually wandering the grounds began gravitating toward the pair, drawn by the palpable sense of connection. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing images of Harold leaning on his cane and Arthur standing tall in his uniform. Social media feeds would soon be flooded with posts describing the encounter, each caption emphasizing the humanity behind the formalities. Amidst the growing buzz, Harold found himself overwhelmed by the collective response. Tears welled up in his eyes, though he blinked them away quickly, unwilling to let emotion fully take hold. He hadn't expected any of this. When he'd decided to visit the palace that morning, it had simply been part of his travel itinerary. A chance to admire the historic architecture and perhaps reflect on days gone by. Never in his wildest dreams had he anticipated being met with such profound acknowledgement. What struck Harold most deeply, however, wasn't the applause or the cameras. It was the sincerity of Arthur's gesture. In that brief moment when their eyes met, Harold felt seen. Not as an old man shuffling through life, but as a soldier who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with comrades, facing dangers unimaginable to many. Arthur's salute validated his experiences, reminding him that his sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere grew even more charged. A group of visitors formed a loose circle around Harold and Arthur, creating a protective barrier against the rest of the bustling crowd. One woman stepped forward timidly, clutching a tissue in her hand. "Excuse me, sir," she said, addressing Harold. "My grandfather served too. He passed away last year, but I know he would have loved seeing this." Her voice trembled as she spoke, and Harold nodded kindly, touched by her words. Others joined, in sharing their own stories of loved ones who had served in various capacities. A retired firefighter recounted tales of heroism during natural disasters, while a teacher explained how her late husband had been a peacekeeper overseas. Each story added another layer to the tapestry of service woven into the fabric of society. Harold listened intently, nodding along and occasionally chiming in with anecdotes of his own. Despite the differences in their backgrounds, they were all connected by a shared appreciation for those who put themselves on the line for others. Meanwhile, Arthur remained rooted in place, his expression unchanged, but his presence undeniably central to the gathering. Though he couldn't engage directly, his earlier gesture continued to resonate. Every glance cast in his direction carried a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Who was this guard who dared defy convention to honor a stranger? What thoughts ran through his mind as he stood there, silently bearing witness to the outpouring of emotion? Unbeknownst to the crowd, Arthur was acutely aware of the weight of the moment. Beneath his polished exterior, he felt a swell of pride, not for himself but for the institution he represented. Guards were often seen as symbols rather than individuals, but today he had managed to bridge that gap. By acknowledging Harold's Salute. He had reminded everyone present that behind every uniform was a person capable of empathy and understanding. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting longer shadows across the courtyard, the impromptu gathering began to disperse. People returned to their tours, snapping photos of statues and fountains as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But for Harold and Arthur, the moment lingered, etched into their memories forever. Harold took one last look at the young guard, before turning to leave. There was a spring in his step now, a renewed energy that hadn't been there earlier. He walked away knowing that his simple act of recognition had sparked something far greater, a reminder that service, in all its forms, deserved to be honored. And Arthur, though unable to follow, watched him go with a quiet sense of fulfillment. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the courtyard buzzed with an energy that hadn't been there moments before. The initial shock of Captain Arthur Langley's subtle salute to Harold Jenkins had given way to a wave of emotion that rippled through the crowd. People who had come to the palace seeking nothing more than a glimpse of history now found themselves part of something far deeper, a moment of connection, respect, and shared humanity. Harold stood quietly, leaning on his cane, as the whispers around him grew louder. Some tourists approached cautiously, their curiosity evident in the way they lingered nearby, unsure whether it was appropriate to intrude. Others, emboldened by the collective warmth of the moment, stepped forward with heartfelt words. A middle-aged woman clutching her child's hand was among the first. "That was beautiful," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "My father served too. He always told me how much it meant when someone recognized his sacrifice." Harold turned to her, his eyes softening at the mention of another veteran. "Thank you for saying that," he replied, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. "It's not about me. It's about everyone who wore the uniform, everyone who gave a piece of themselves so others could live in peace." His words resonated deeply, prompting nods of agreement from those within earshot. The woman smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, and gently nudged her young son forward. "Say thank you to the nice man, sweetheart," she encouraged. The boy, no older than 6, looked up at Harold with wide, innocent eyes. After a brief hesitation, he extended a small hand and whispered, "Thank you for protecting us." Harold bent down slightly, taking the boy's hand in his own weathered one. "You're very welcome, young man," he said warmly. "Promise me you'll always remember what service means, not just wearing a uniform, but helping others however you can." The boy nodded solemnly, clearly moved by the gravity of the moment. His mother wiped away a tear, mouthing a silent thank you to Harold before leading her son away. But the exchange didn't end there. Inspired by the boy's gesture, others began stepping forward, each wanting to share their own story or express their gratitude. A retired firefighter named Robert joined the growing circle around Harold. Clad in a simple jacket emblazoned with the insignia of his former department, he introduced himself with a respectful nod. "I'm not military, but I spent 30 years running into burning buildings instead of away from them," he said with a self-deprecating chuckle. "Your salute reminded me of the camaraderie we felt after every call, knowing we'd made a difference even if just for one family." Harold listened intently, nodding along. "That's exactly what it's about," he said, his tone warm and encouraging. "Service isn't limited to one field. Whether you're fighting fires, teaching kids, or standing guard like this young man here," he gestured toward Arthur, "it all matters. It all adds up to something bigger than ourselves." Robert grinned, visibly touched by Harold's words. "Well, sir, let me shake your hand," he said, extending his arm. Harold accepted the handshake, gripping firmly despite the frailty of his own hands. As they parted, Robert added, "If I could salute you too, I would, but I think my old bones might embarrass me." The comment drew laughter from the group, lightening the mood momentarily while still preserving the reverence of the occasion. Elsewhere in the courtyard, a teacher named Emily recounted the story of her late husband, who had served as a peacekeeper overseas. "He came home changed," she admitted, her voice tinged with both sadness and pride. "But he never stopped believing in the importance of helping others, no matter where they were from or what language they spoke. She paused, glancing at Arthur, then back at Harold. Seeing this today, it's a reminder that kindness transcends borders just like service does. Her words struck a chord with many in the crowd. Heads nodded in agreement and murmurs of affirmation rippled through the gathering. Even those who hadn't served personally felt connected to the stories being shared. A college student named Sarah, visiting the palace with friends, spoke up hesitantly. "I've never done anything heroic," she admitted, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "But hearing all of you talk, it makes me want to do more. To volunteer, to help out, to make a difference somehow." Harold smiled kindly at her. "That's all any of us can hope for. That our actions inspire others to carry the torch. You don't need to wear a uniform to serve. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness are the most powerful." Sarah beamed, clearly moved by his encouragement. Beside her, her friends exchanged glances, already whispering ideas for volunteer projects they could take on together. Throughout the exchange, Arthur remained steadfast in his position, his posture unwavering despite the emotional weight of the scene unfolding around him. Though he couldn't move or speak freely, his presence loomed large over the gathering. Every glance cast in his direction carried a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Who was this guard who had dared to break protocol, however subtly, to honor a stranger? What thoughts ran through his mind as he stood there, silently bearing witness to the outpouring of emotion? For Arthur, the experience was both humbling and overwhelming. Beneath his polished exterior, he felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for the institution he represented. Guards were often seen as symbols rather than individuals, but today he had managed to bridge that gap. By acknowledging Harold's salute, he had reminded everyone present that behind every uniform was a person capable of empathy and understanding. As the crowd continued to grow, some visitors began clapping, not loudly but steadily, creating a rhythm that echoed through the courtyard. The applause started tentatively, almost shyly, but soon gained momentum. Tourists lining the edges of the gathering joined in, their hands coming together in a show of solidarity. Even children, initially distracted by the novelty of the palace grounds, clapped enthusiastically, mimicking the adults around them. Harold blinked rapidly, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected display of gratitude. He hadn't sought recognition. He had simply wanted to pay his respects to a fellow servant of duty. Yet here he was, surrounded by strangers who saw him not just as an elderly man, but as a symbol of resilience and sacrifice. Tears welled up in his eyes, though he blinked them away quickly, unwilling to let emotion fully take hold. "What is this?" Harold asked, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the crowd. "I didn't expect any of this." His words only fueled the applause, which grew louder and more sustained. Someone shouted, "We're thanking you," prompting cheers from others. For a moment, Harold seemed lost for words, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces before him. Then with a deep breath, he raised his hand again, not in a salute this time, but in a gesture of acknowledgement. Arthur, too, felt the weight of the moment. Though he couldn't join in the applause, he allowed himself the smallest of smiles, a fleeting curve of his lips that went unnoticed by most, but spoke volumes to those who caught it. His earlier gesture, restrained though it had been, had sparked something extraordinary. It had reminded everyone present that acts of kindness, no matter how small, could have a profound impact. As the minutes ticked by, the impromptu gathering began to disperse. Visitors returned to their tours, snapping photos of statues and fountains as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But the memory of what had transpired lingered in the air, palpable and undeniable. Strangers exchanged knowing glances united by the shared experience. Some promised to share the story with friends and family, while others vowed to reflect on the importance of recognizing service in all its forms. Harold, meanwhile, took one last look at Arthur before turning to leave. There was a spring in his step now, a renewed energy that hadn't been there earlier. He walked away knowing that his simple act of recognition had sparked something far greater, a reminder that service, in all its forms, deserved to be honored. And Arthur, though unable to follow, watched him go with a quiet sense of fulfillment. The events of that morning lingered in Harold Jenkins' mind long after he left the palace grounds. As he made his way back to his modest hotel room, the weight of what had transpired settled over him like a comforting blanket. He hadn't gone to the palace expecting anything extraordinary. It was simply another stop on his journey, a chance to soak in the history and grandeur of a place he'd admired from afar for years. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it, and Harold found himself deeply moved by the connection he'd forged with Captain Arthur Langley, and through him with the countless strangers who had gathered to witness their exchange. That evening, as the city lights twinkled outside his window, Harold sat down at the small desk in his room. The pen he held felt oddly heavy in his hand, not because of its physical weight but because of the emotion swirling within him. He wanted to put his thoughts into words, to express gratitude not just for Arthur's gesture, but for the ripple effect it had created among the crowd. After some deliberation, he decided to write a letter, not to Arthur personally, though he wished he could, but to the regiment overseeing the Royal Guards. They needed to know how much that moment had meant not only to him but also to everyone who had been there. Harold began writing slowly, choosing each word carefully. "Dear sirs," he started, pausing briefly to collect his thoughts before continuing. "I am writing to express my heartfelt thanks for the conduct of one of your guards today, a young man named Captain Arthur Langley. While standing watch, at his post he performed an act so simple yet profoundly meaningful that it brought tears to my eyes and those of many others present." He went on to describe the encounter in detail, recounting how he had saluted Arthur out of respect for his role as a guardian of tradition and duty. "It wasn't about breaking protocol or seeking attention," Harold explained. "It was about recognizing the shared values that bind us all: service, sacrifice, and honor. When Captain Langley acknowledged my salute, even in the subtlest of ways, it spoke volumes. It reminded me that behind every uniform is a human being capable of empathy and understanding." As Harold wrote, memories of the day flooded back. The gasps of surprise from the crowd, the applause that followed, and the stories shared by people whose lives had been touched by acts of service. He described how the gathering had transformed from a casual tourist attraction into a celebration of humanity, where strangers connected over shared experiences and mutual respect. "In that moment," Harold penned, "we weren't just individuals passing through a historic site. We were part of something greater, a reminder that kindness transcends boundaries, whether they be generational, cultural, or professional." He concluded the letter by emphasizing the importance of such gestures. Captain Langley's actions may have seemed small to some, but they carried immense significance. In a world often divided by differences, moments like these remind us of our common humanity. Please convey my deepest appreciation to him and to your entire regiment for upholding traditions that inspire admiration and respect. When Harold finished writing, he read the letter aloud to himself, ensuring it conveyed the depth of his feelings without sounding overly sentimental. Satisfied, he folded it neatly, slipped it into an envelope, and addressed it to the commanding officer of the Royal Guard Regiment. The next morning he mailed it, feeling a sense of closure and hope that his words would reach the right ears. Unbeknownst to Harold, his letter sparked a chain reaction within the regiment. When it arrived on the commanding officer's desk, days later, it was met with a mixture of curiosity and pride. Colonel Richard Pembroke, a seasoned leader known for his commitment to both discipline and compassion, read the letter twice before summoning Captain Langley to his office. "Arthur," the colonel began, holding up the envelope. "Do you know why I've called you here?" Arthur stiffened slightly, unsure whether he was about to face reprimand or praise. Though his gesture had been well received by the public, he knew bending protocol, even slightly, could invite scrutiny. "A letter arrived this morning," Pembroke continued, "from a man named Harold Jenkins. Does that name sound familiar?" Arthur nodded cautiously. "Yes, sir. He's the veteran who saluted me during my post last week." His tone was measured, betraying none of the apprehension he felt. The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying Arthur intently. "Mr. Jenkins wrote to commend your actions that day. He says your response to his salute reminded him of the importance of recognizing service in all its forms. Care to explain yourself? For a moment, Arthur hesitated. Then, drawing a deep breath, he recounted the events of that morning. The elderly man's crisp salute, the wave of emotion that had washed over him, and the decision to acknowledge it subtly while maintaining his position. "Sir, I understood the significance of his gesture," Arthur said earnestly. "It wasn't just a salute, it was a bridge between generations. I believed acknowledging it, even minimally, was the right thing to do." Colonel Pembroke listened silently, his expression unreadable. When Arthur finished speaking, the colonel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You're aware that protocol dictates no movement during your post?" he asked pointedly. Arthur nodded. "Yes, sir. I am fully aware." The colonel paused, then broke into a rare smile. "And yet sometimes rules exist to guide us, not to confine us. Your judgment that day served a greater purpose. You represented our regiment not just as a symbol, but as a person capable of empathy. That's something to be proud of." Relief washed over Arthur, though he maintained his composure. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice steady. "I acted based on instinct, but I stand by my decision." The colonel nodded approvingly. "Good, because your actions didn't just honor Mr. Jenkins, they honored us all. This letter will be shared with the entire regiment as an example of how discretion and humanity can coexist within duty." Word of Harold's letter spread quickly among the ranks. Fellow guards expressed admiration for Arthur's restraint and foresight, recognizing the delicate balance he had struck between tradition and compassion. Some joked good-naturedly about aspiring to match his level of poise under pressure, while others reflected more seriously on the implications of the moment. It became a topic of discussion during training sessions, prompting debates about the role of empathy in military service. Meanwhile, outside the regiment, the story gained traction in the media. Someone in the crowd that day had recorded the interaction and uploaded it to social media, where it quickly went viral. News outlets picked up the clip, framing it as a heartwarming tale of intergenerational respect. Comment sections filled, with messages of gratitude, admiration, and calls for Arthur to be publicly recognized for his actions. Hashtags like "Salute of Respect" and "Humanity in Uniform" trended across platforms, sparking conversations about the importance of acknowledging service in everyday life. Back at the palace, visitors began asking specifically about the guard who saluted the veteran. Tour guides incorporated the story into their narratives, describing it as a testament to the enduring spirit of camaraderie and mutual respect. Even tourists who hadn't witnessed the event firsthand felt its impact, inspired by the idea that small gestures could create lasting connections. For Harold, the growing attention came as a pleasant surprise. He received several messages from friends and acquaintances who had seen news coverage of the incident, congratulating him for shining a light on the value of recognition. Though flattered, Harold remained humble, deflecting praise onto Arthur and the broader message of unity. "It wasn't about me," he told anyone who asked. "It was about reminding people that service, whether in war, peacekeeping, firefighting, teaching, or any other field, deserves to be honored. If my salute helped do that, then I'm grateful." The story took on a life of its own, transcending individual accolades and becoming a symbol of something larger. Schools used it as a teaching moment, encouraging students to think about ways they could show gratitude to those who served their communities. Community organizations organized events to celebrate local heroes, inspired by the idea that recognition fosters connection. And within the palace walls, Captain Arthur Langley continued his duties with quiet dignity, knowing that his small act of acknowledgement had left an indelible mark on countless lives. Though separated by distance and circumstance, Harold and Arthur remained linked by the bond they had unknowingly forged that morning. Their encounter served as a powerful reminder that even in a world often divided by differences, shared values could unite us. All it took was a single gesture of respect to spark change. Weeks after the unforgettable encounter at the palace, Harold Jenkins received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was addressed to him in neat, formal handwriting, bearing the official insignia of the Royal Guard Regiment. Curious and slightly apprehensive, Harold opened it carefully. Inside was a note from Colonel Richard Pembroke, the commanding officer of the Guards. The letter expressed gratitude for Harold's own gesture that day, the salute he had given Captain Arthur Langley, and extended an invitation for Harold to return to the palace as a guest of honor. The purpose of the visit, the colonel explained, was twofold: to formally recognize Harold's contribution to fostering a moment of unity and respect, and to unveil a commemorative plaque honoring the bond between generations of service members. Harold read the letter twice, his hands trembling slightly as he absorbed its contents. He hadn't expected anything like this. His salute had been a personal act meant only to convey respect. Yet here he was, being celebrated not just for what he'd done, but for what it represented. Harold accepted the invitation without hesitation. On the appointed day, he arrived at the palace gates dressed in his finest suit, the same cap perched proudly on his head. His cane tapped rhythmically against the cobblestone path as he made his way toward the courtyard where the ceremony would take place. As he approached, he noticed a small crowd gathered. Tourists, local dignitaries, and members of the regiment all stood together, their faces glowing with anticipation. Standing near the front, out of uniform but unmistakably present, was Captain Arthur Langley. When Harold entered the courtyard, the murmurs of the crowd quieted, giving way to respectful applause. Arthur stepped forward to greet him, his demeanor calm yet warm. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to see you again." Harold shook his hand firmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "The honor is mine, young man," he replied. "I didn't expect any of this." Arthur chuckled softly. "Neither did I, to be honest. But your letter, it reminded us all why we do what we do. Not just to follow orders, but to connect, to serve with heart as well as duty." The two men exchanged a few more words before taking their places near the center of the gathering. Behind them stood a modest wooden podium, flanked by flowers and a gleaming brass plaque mounted on a stone pedestal. The inscription read, "In recognition of mutual respect and shared service, a tribute to those who serve past and present." Beneath the text were the names of Harold Jenkins and Captain Arthur Langley, etched side by side as a testament to the connection they had forged. Colonel Pembroke stepped up to the podium to address the crowd. His voice carried clearly over the hushed courtyard as he began speaking. "Today we gather to celebrate something truly special, a moment that transcended protocol and touched hearts. What started as a simple exchange between a veteran and a guard became a symbol of unity, reminding us all of the power of human connection." He turned to Harold, nodding respectfully. "Mr. Jenkins, your salute that morning was more than just a gesture. It was a bridge. You reminded us that behind every uniform is a person, and behind every person is a story worth hearing. And Captain Langley, your response demonstrated the very best qualities of our regiment: discipline, empathy, and a willingness to adapt when compassion demands it." The colonel paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "This plaque stands as a permanent reminder of that day, not just for those who witnessed it, but for future generations who will walk these grounds. It reminds us that acts of kindness, no matter how small, can have a profound impact. Let it inspire us to seek out opportunities to honor one another, whether through words, gestures, or actions." As the colonel concluded his speech, the crowd erupted into applause once again. Harold and Arthur stepped forward together to unveil the plaque, pulling back the ceremonial cloth draped over it. Sunlight glinted off the polished brass, illuminating the engraved words. For Harold, seeing his name alongside Arthur's filled him with a deep sense of pride, not for himself but for the message it conveyed. This wasn't about individual recognition. It was about celebrating the shared values that united people across time and circumstance. After the unveiling, Harold was invited to say a few words. He hesitated briefly, adjusting his cap as he gathered his thoughts. Then, leaning lightly on his cane, he addressed the crowd. When I came here weeks ago, I never imagined I'd leave with so much more than memories, he began, his voice steady, despite the emotion thickening it. I came to pay my respects to someone doing a job I deeply admire. What I found instead was a reminder of why we serve: to protect, to inspire, and to build connections. Harold paused, scanning the faces before him. This plaque isn't just for me or Captain Langley. It's for everyone who has ever worn a uniform, picked up tools to help a neighbor, or simply shown kindness to a stranger. Service comes in many forms, and each one matters. If there's one thing I hope you take away today, it's this: never underestimate the power of a single moment. A smile, a handshake, even a salute. They can change lives in ways we may never fully understand. His words were met with thunderous applause, echoing through the courtyard and spilling out into the surrounding gardens. Many in the audience wiped away tears, moved not just by Harold's humility but by the universality of his message. Afterward, visitors lined up to shake Harold's hand and thank him personally. Some shared their own stories of service, while others expressed gratitude for the reminder of humanity's capacity for connection. Throughout the event, Arthur remained close by, occasionally stepping in to assist Harold or answer questions from curious attendees. Though he still embodied the quiet professionalism expected of a royal guard, there was a newfound warmth in his interactions. People thanked him too, not just for his role in the original moment, but for representing the spirit of service so authentically. One elderly woman, her eyes misty with emotion, told him, "You gave my grandson hope. He wants to join the military now because of what he saw online." Arthur nodded humbly, replying, "Then I'm glad I could play a part in inspiring him. But remember, it's not just about uniforms or titles. True service comes from the heart." The end of the ceremony, Harold felt a renewed sense of purpose. The experience had reignited his passion for storytelling, prompting him to consider sharing more of his own experiences with younger generations. Perhaps, he thought, he could visit schools or community centers to talk about the importance of recognizing service in all its forms. As he prepared to leave the palace grounds, Arthur walked him to the gate, ensuring he had everything he needed for the journey home. "Thank you again, Mr. Jenkins," Arthur said sincerely. "For everything." Harold patted him gently on the shoulder. "No, thank you, Captain Langley. You reminded me that the world is full of good people willing to go the extra mile. Don't ever lose sight of that." With a final wave, Harold turned and began walking away, his steps lighter than they had been in years. Arthur watched him go, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. The events of that day had reinforced his belief in the importance of balancing tradition with empathy, a lesson he knew he would carry with him throughout his career. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, the plaque stood tall and gleaming, a beacon of hope and unity. Tourists continued to stop and read its inscription, pausing to reflect on its meaning. In a world often divided by differences, it served as a reminder that moments of connection, no matter how fleeting, could leave lasting legacies. And for Harold and Arthur, whose paths had crossed in such an extraordinary way, it marked the beginning of a friendship rooted in mutual respect and shared values.